And I'm going to hand it off to Colin Nackerman. He's our Associate Director of Policy and Operations at the consortium. Take it away, Colin.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. I am thrilled to introduce our panelists today and discuss with them what we all know to be our biggest challenge and our biggest opportunity within our shared mission to address the health impacts of climate change and air pollution and the deep inequities within our current fossil fuel-based system. As you probably know, there's arguably never been a more critical time to learn about and discuss how policy with our participation can help drive a rapid clean energy transition with equity at the forefront. I think our conversation today will help explain why that's the case. So today we brought together an all-star panel that has expertise and insights on how advocacy and policymaking at the local, state, and federal level. I've had the pleasure of working closely with these three organizations that Olivia, Charles, and Matthew work for. And I can testify that they're world leaders in moving us toward our shared goals on these issues. So really excited. So I'll first just start with giving some background on each speaker before we dive in. But please also check out the program guide for their longer bios. So first up, Olivia Nedd serves as the Senior Policy Director of the Access and Equity Program at Vote Solar. In this role, she works to support Vote Solar's policy and regulatory work to advance a more equitable and just clean energy future. Prior to joining Vote Solar, Olivia worked with Florida conservation voters, where she led a statewide campaign to bring electric school buses to low-income and communities of color. Charles Bolden is the Director of Congressional Affairs at the Solar Energy Industries Association, and Charles leads SEIA's energy and carbon portfolio. Charles started off his career in politics working for Congressman Danny K. Davis of Illinois as a fellow. And prior to joining SEIA, Charles previously served several roles in Representative Robin Kelly's office, more recently as her energy advisor, including helping to lead an Energy and Commerce Committee roundtable on diversity in the energy industry. With 6 years of Capitol Hill experience, he has a deep network and strong relationships on both sides of the aisle. Matthew Davis is the Senior Director of Government Affairs at the League of Conservation Voters. There, he works on a wide variety of legislative and administrative policy issues with a focus on climate change, clean energy, and air pollution. Prior to joining LCV, he was a career civil servant for a decade at the EPA in the Office of Congressional Affairs and Office of Children's Health Protection, managing inquiries, technical translation, and relationships with congressional offices and committees, and helping them to develop regulations in accordance with the science of children's unique vulnerabilities, respectively. He got a start working in environmental policy and organizing in Maine, where he founded and ran Environment Maine, a nonprofit advocacy group that is part of Environment America Network. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass it off to Olivia for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I'm really excited to be here. I'll give it a second until my slides pop up. There we go. All right. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Olivia Nedd, and I'm the Senior Policy Director on the Access and Equity team at Vote Solar. And I'm just going to set the stage for our discussion today on addressing climate through equitable energy policy. So next slide, please. So just a quick bit about Vote Solar. We are a nonprofit state-level advocacy organization, and we operate in the legislative and regulatory arenas at the state level, where most decisions about electricity are being made. Next slide, please. So at the state level, there are a number of decision makers and stakeholders that influence the energy system. You have public utility commissions who are either elected or they are appointed depending on the state that you're in. And they're really responsible for assuring that the utilities are providing reasonable and adequate, efficient service to customers. And then you have utility companies. They are either investor owned, they're cooperatives, or they can be municipal municipal utilities. And then you have state legislators who are also really important in terms of saying, this is the kinds of policy and legislation that we want, and then telling the public utility commissions to go out and execute it. And then interested stakeholders, that other group, that's where organizations like mine and membership organizations like yours sit, where we are saying, hey, we have an interested stake in making sure that the outcomes at public utility commissions are reflective of the needs of the community and that they are equitable and fair. Next slide, please. So something that's at top of mind for me when I think about energy policy and what we really need to be focusing on, particularly for low-income individuals, is the concept of energy burden. And I want to say that particularly utility companies and public utility commissions need to be focusing on this, because utilities are the single largest source of funding for low-income energy efficiency programs. So they're providing about 41% of ratepayer funding for these low-income bill assistance programs. And so they're responsible for designing and implementing them, making sure that low-income individuals have access to these programs. And so if you really take a look at how things look now, I'm going to just go as far to say is we're not doing a really good job of addressing energy burden for these particular populations. Across the country, energy burden sits at about 3%, but when you hone in specifically on low income individuals, you're seeing that number to be about 8.6%. So that's 3 times higher that a low income individual is paying for their energy versus the average American. Next slide, please. So why do these individuals have higher energy burden? There's a host of factors, but what I do is I group them into these 5 categories just to really frame them up, is that you have things like, just because of the place that you live and your geography, you have high energy burden. You can't help it if you live in a rural community or on Native American territory. It's inevitable to have high energy burden. You have housing characteristics where we typically see low income individuals living in older housing. They have older appliances, or they live in rental properties where they can't control their electricity. And then you also have socioeconomic, where it's things like redlining that is a result of why folks are situated where they are and they have high energy burden, or their immigration status, or their ethnicity and race. And then you have energy prices and policies. A lot of utility companies have things in place like reconnection fees, where we disconnect your energy, you have to pay in order to get it back on. That doesn't seem quite fair for the individuals who we already know are strapped and have to pay a higher portion of their bill in order to access energy. And then you have the last category of behavioral factors. Sometimes people just operate based on their cultural beliefs, lifestyle habits, things that they have just been taught, or just that they don't have the knowledge as to how to interact with the energy system. Next slide, please. So at the nexus of energy and health, what is really important for me and what I think about is your home. This is so central to everything. More than 25 million US households will reduce or forego medicine or food in order to pay for their energy costs. And the adverse health effects that high energy burdens can have, they span the range of illnesses and conditions. So that can include things like thermal discomfort. You have a lot of respiratory problems like asthma as a result of exposure to the indoor air pollution. So nearly 13 million US households will experience leaving their homes at an unhealthy temperature. And this is due to the fact that they just can't afford it. They can't afford to either turn the AC on or turn the heat on, which is really unfortunate to see today. So next slide, please. So the benefits of clean energy. We know that environmental benefits, you get less air pollution, we reduce water use, fossil fuels, clean air, and then the respiratory benefits that clean energy provides. But what I really want to focus in on is the tangible customer savings is a benefit. What I really want to see when we're delivering clean energy to individuals is that they can get money in their pockets. If you don't have to worry about paying your electricity bill or paying so much more for your electricity bill, that frees up dollars for you to be able to spend it on proper food or the medications that you need or transportation so you can get to and from work. Next slide, please. So with the federal policy, I'm going to touch lightly on this because I believe my co-panelists will really focus on this, but there's a lot of federal programs that we could either reprogram or retool in order to really deliver the benefits of clean energy to customers. So you have the Weatherization Assistance Program, for example. The state of Colorado, what they've been able to do with this money from the federal government is pair energy efficiency with solar, and they're able to deliver that to customers so that they're able to not only reduce the effects and the impacts that they have in their household, but to also reap the benefits of solar on their rooftops. So I'll leave the federal policy for my federal experts, but next slide. Where I really sit is at state policy and understanding what are the things that states need to do in terms of making clean energy available and accessible to low-income individuals. And so at the state level, I've listed out here all of the policies that I think are really important, but what I want to highlight are two that are just the peak of all the policies that we need to be really pursuing in this space. And that's renewable portfolio standards. If we don't have a requirement in place that says a specific percentage of electricity will be coming from renewable energy resources, it's really hard to say that utility companies are just going to do it on their own. They have to have a requirement or a mandate to make them go forward and do it. But in addition to that, what I want to see are carve outs for low income customers saying that we are going to deliver a specific percentage of these benefits to these communities. Because what we do know and what history has shown us is that if we aren't specific and if we don't say it and if we don't write it down, it's very difficult and unlikely that those benefits will happen and happen in the way that we want to see them. And then finally, financing. I think like it's good and all for me to talk about bringing solar and bringing energy efficiency to households. But if we are realistic, it is very difficult for a low income household to even pay for the solar panel. So if they can't pay for their groceries and their medical needs because they're trying to figure out, what do I do with my energy bill? How do we expect them to put solar on their homes? And this is one place that I think states can really step up and step in, is finding ways to create financing mechanisms that really make solar accessible to low income and communities of color. Next slide, please. So I'm really all about getting involved and taking action, and how do we actually make change? So at the top, myself in conjunction with Grid Alternatives, we run the Low Income Solar Policy Guide. It's called lowincomesolar.org. This is a website and a resource that you can go to, and it'll give you all the basic information and facts about low income solar. What I'm going to skip down to are the regional and state opportunities. So this is like a real place for you to plug in, get your hands dirty, and make some change. So in North Carolina, legislation has recently passed where they have to finalize their carbon plan by the end of the year. And so in order for them to meet their goals, Duke Energy has been tasked with running stakeholder planning sessions. This is a really great way for you to get in and say, this is what we want to see happening. These are the kinds of things we want Duke to be putting up and doing. And this is particularly in North Carolina. So the People Power North Carolina Coalition is taking the lead on this. And this is a really good place to get involved. The second one is the Midwest Grid Equity and Reliability Planning. This is a multi-state planning effort between Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois. So this is looking to ensure that considerations of equity are fully incorporated into utility distribution planning. So taking a look at where are the poles and wires going, who's accessing them, who has reliability, and things like that. And then the last one that I encourage folks to get involved in is the California High DER future proceeding. So California opened up a docket to look at the future of distributed energy resources. So where are things like energy efficiency, storage, solar, vehicles, all of those things, where are they going to go? Who's going to have access? So that's another really great opportunity to get involved. So that's it for me. If you're interested in getting involved in any of those, and plus there's like a lot of other things that we do, I just don't have enough time to tell you about all of them, please email me. My email is on that last slide. I'd be more than happy to talk, connect, and share anything else I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. I think now we are going to jump over to Charles.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some. My name is Charles Bolden. I'm the Director of Congressional Affairs here at Solar Energy Industries Association, otherwise known as SEIA. We are a trade association comprised of over 1,000 member companies across the nation. We have been really focusing on a lot of the things in the federal space, including the Build Back Better Act, as well as the investment, the bipartisan infrastructure package. We've been hosting a number of lobby days focused on environmental justice provisions that are included in the Build Back Better Act. Some of those key components I'll go over in this presentation, but just want to kind of give you guys a general overview of what we've been working on here at SEIA. As you all know, public policy is critical for tackling the climate crisis and building an equitable, clean energy future in America. There is a critical role for environmental justice in these policy discussions, and climate solutions must take into account the disproportionate impacts felt by disadvantaged communities. The transition to a clean energy economy must be centered around justice and equity for all Americans, and support communities that have historically been left behind by environmental justice policies. The Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, took a number of steps in advancing environmental justice, including expanding access to clean drinking water, tackling legacy pollution, and investing in public transit. We appreciate these important steps, but there is much more work to be done. Key provisions in the Build Back Better Act can truly accelerate a just transition to a clean economy, providing economic well-being for frontline communities and delivering a healthy and prosperous future. We cannot afford to miss out on this opportunity, and Congress must act to deliver a robust Build Back Better package, which includes a strong focus on clean energy growth and environmental justice. Some of the key provisions that we've been focusing on in the Build Back Better Act are the long-term extension of the investment tax credit with direct pay, otherwise known as the ITC. Disadvantaged communities are disproportionately harmed by the effects of climate change. These same communities are simultaneously the least culpable for the carbon emissions that are created through the crisis in the first place. The ITC is a proven tool for driving deployment of clean energy and reducing carbon emissions from the power sector. A long-term extension of the ITC is a key policy tool to tackle climate change while creating good-paying union jobs and investing in underserved communities. The inclusion of direct pay in the Build Back Better Act will speed deployment of community solar projects, allow greater participation in the clean energy economy. 25D refundability for the ITC. Currently, only families with high tax liability can take advantage of the ITC, and Build Back Better, the inclusion of Section 25D refundability makes the credit more equitable and accessible to families across all income levels. The ITC for low-income residential and Indian land. In Build Back Better, the bill actually includes a bonus tax credit for building solar energy products in low-income communities, low-income residential buildings, and on Indian land. This provision will help make clean energy more accessible to historically underserved communities while driving economic growth. The ITC bonus credit. Build Back Better includes a bonus credit to the ITC for building solar energy projects in an energy community. An energy community is defined as a census tract or adjacent tract where at least 5% of employment is within oil and gas sector in the year construction begins. After December 31st, 1999, a coal mine has closed, or after December 31st, 2009, or a coal-fired electric generating unit has been retired. This provision will provide for a just transition away from fossil fuels, providing economic opportunity for communities that have traditionally relied on fossil-based economy. REAP, so Rural Energy for America program. Build Back Better includes additional funds for the REAP program, which offers grants and loans to farmers and rural businesses for renewable energy and energy efficient projects, speeding the transition to clean energy for rural communities and helping mitigate the effects of climate change. I'll go down to one of the ones that we are focused on very much so right now is workforce development. And Build Back Better, the workforce development programs are critical to help American workers gain secure good paying jobs and provide employers the talent they need to succeed and grow. This includes important investments in strengthening workforce programs to combat climate change and pivot the country towards clean energy sources through expanding clean energy apprenticeship programs. So those are some of the things that we've been doing as far as getting more of those provisions and talking to members of Congress. We recently had an Environmental Justice Lobby Day, which lasted 4 or 5 days, and we met with over 10 members of Congress in both the House and Senate. What we encourage everyone to do, and I know that, you know, a lot of the conversation around Build Back Better is we're transitioning from that conversation, from the title of Build Back Better to something that can be maybe a smaller package, but including those energy provisions that are focused on environmental justice is something that we are definitely doing. And what members of Congress are saying, and what I know for a fact, is that there are strength in numbers. So while I say that, I encourage everyone on this call to reach out to your member of Congress and speak to them, write to them, call them, tell your friends to reach out to them, to discuss some of those provisions that you feel are important, because those members of Congress really listen to the constituents who are reaching out to discuss the legislation that are very impactful to their community. So I encourage everyone on this call again to please feel free to reach out to your member of Congress, your senator, let them know that these provisions or provisions that you all feel are important to you and your community need to be addressed. Email them, call them, send them letters if you can. And with that, I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak to you all today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Charles. That was really helpful, and you know, it's always just so great to know that SIA is fighting hard for these things, and you know, as I think folks may know, you know, the solar industry has grown so fast in the last decade, especially, and you know, it's so important that small and large companies are coming together to, you know, to keep fighting for these things. So we'll talk more about that in a second. I'm going to pass it to Matthew Davis, who is also going to speak. And just FYI, there's no slides for this as well either. But we, yeah, pass it off to Matt.
Thank you so much, Colin, and thank you to Charles and Olivia. It's a pleasure to be on the panel here with you today. And thank you to the Medical Society Consortium and all of you as really engaged activists and public health professionals. As you know, Charles was just saying, your voices are really key here and important. And members of Congress, they want to hear from you. Your voices help push them and encourage them and give them the added energy to really push for a clean energy economy moving forward. So thank you all for your past activism and future activism. My name again is Matthew Davis, and I'm the Senior Director of Government Affairs here at the League of Conservation Voters, or LCV. I have a Master's of Public Health, so I'm very dialed in and sympathetic to the health arguments around climate and transitioning to cleaner sources of energy, and as well as advancing environmental justice and solving some of the lasting injustices in terms of environmental exposures. A little bit about LCV. LCV builds political power for people on the planet. We influence policy, hold politicians accountable, and help win elections. This is how we see our model for how we fight for a better world with clean air, clean water, public lands, a safe climate, all protected with a just and equitable democracy. Over the past 50 years, we've grown into a really potent national political force with over 1 million members, 30 state affiliates, and grassroots and community organizing programs in a number of different states and communities around the country. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I really think that this is an exciting time for the fight for climate action and for environmental justice. We have quite a ways to go, and our window of opportunity is to some extent closing or getting smaller, but we have never been as far as we are today. And so that to me is very exciting, and I think provides a lot of opportunity and a lot of hope for the work that I do and for the work that you all do on top of your jobs in the medical field. So thank you again for your energy and your activism. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation of the infrastructure law and some of the important things that you can help shape as the government, the federal government and state governments roll out spending from this big bill that did go through that has some good investments in climate. I'm going to talk a little bit sort of big picture, since Charles really got into some of the details about what's in the Build Back Better provisions, or the provisions formerly known as the Build Back Better provisions. So I'll talk a little bit sort of big picture about where that's heading. And then also talk about some of the other federal administrative opportunities to push for climate and health. And there are a lot of those that have been sort of rolling out in the past few months, and more to come in the upcoming months. So anyway, thank you so much again, and I'll dive right in here. You know, I think there's been a lot of progress so far in the past year for on the fight for climate and for justice. We saw passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, or just known as the infrastructure law or the bipartisan infrastructure law. This law really provided, I think, a good deal of investments. I see them sort of as initial investments in climate action. We have seen recently the electric vehicles charging money, which was a record $7.5 billion, rolling out from the Department of Transportation in partnership with the Department of Energy. You know, in all of these sort of pieces where the federal government is now working on getting money out the door, either directly to, you know, local governments or nonprofits who are doing the work on the ground, or to states to then distribute to those sort of end use entities. We certainly have been focusing on pushing those, both the federal and state agencies, to focus on maximizing pollution reductions and maximizing equity. As part of the Biden administration's focus on environmental justice and equity and racial justice and equity, they have adopted the Justice 40 initiative, where they are committing to delivering at least 40% of the benefits from these investments to formerly disadvantaged communities. These are, you know, primarily communities that are low wealth. They're communities of color. They are communities that have been often left out, purposely left out for reasons of racial exclusion or other, totally unfair practices. And so the Biden-Harris administration is really committing to getting the investments into those communities. And we, as the general public and very interested and engaged activists, are an important voice to be pushing and encouraging that continued focus on equity. And so certainly when it comes to electric vehicle charging infrastructure, making sure that communities, whether it's low income housing or simply multifamily housing, where it's challenging for individuals to install their own charging for an electric vehicle, to make sure that they have adequate infrastructure. It also is, focusing on ports and making sure that when it comes to goods movement, we're cleaning up the pollution from those trucks, from those ships, from those rail yards, and again, driving potentially electric vehicle infrastructure into those places, so that we're transitioning away from polluting sources to clean sources that are better for health and better for our climate. There was a recent announcement from the federal government of nearly $500 million in investment in ports. This is something that's primarily run out of Department of Transportation, but with some cross-departmental engagement. And so the public being engaged in those processes, pushing for that equity, pushing for the emissions reductions, I think is essential. We also see activity ramping up with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, my former employer, around school buses. There's a good deal of funding, approximately $7.5 billion for funding of electric school buses, and then $3.5 billion for electric buses and $3.5 billion for clean buses. We are looking to encourage the EPA to focus on zero emission buses, which at this point primarily are electric school buses, with that second portion of that sort of second bucket of funding. We think it's essential that we be moving to zero emission vehicles, and that we be focusing those in communities that are facing the highest pollution burdens, which again are usually low wealth communities. They're communities of color. They're folks who are living closer to roads and other pollution sources. So there are opportunities there, again, for folks to advocate. I'd also say that the Department of Energy has opportunities as well to focus, whether it's focus on green hydrogen as opposed to sort of any kinds of hydrogen, which some of which are still quite dirty, and also for carbon capture and sequestration, to focus on those industrial sources that need the help with decarbonization the most. When it comes to electricity, we have great alternatives. We have solar power, we have wind power, and we have rapidly expanding and becoming more affordable energy storage solutions. So best not to be spending money on carbon capture on electricity generation. Other administrative actions that I'd highlight that I think are really key to engage with are coming out of the Environmental Protection Agency. We're expecting a rule around clean trucks to be announced soon. Those would reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides, not as much focused on climate change pollutants, but reducing smog forming pollution is really important to maintain health when air quality is projected to be worse. Ambient air quality is projected to be worse as temperatures increase overall. And so not only do we have to improve people's health, but we have to do more just to maintain sort of status quo of air pollution and air quality. So that's a really key one, where there'll be a public comment period coming soon after announcement. And then in the coming months after that, we expect both rules around power plants and rules around what are called the ambient air quality standards for particulate matter, or soot pollution, which will also be proposed. Those we're expecting in the summertime. The last thing I'll just hit upon is, I think, overall picture with Build Back Better. We see a path forward for the $555 billion in Build Back Better climate, jobs, and justice provisions. These are these are the provisions that Charles laid out. There are many more in addition to what he articulated, but he articulated the most important pieces, I'd say. We see there's a path forward. The past couple months have looked a little bleak. You've heard a lot of people say, oh, Build Back Better is dead. I think in name only, Build Back Better is dead. The climate, jobs, and justice provisions are not dead. They are agreed upon across the Democratic caucus. Senator Manchin himself said basically, yeah, we're going to do tax reform provisions that will raise money. We have a prescription drug package that's been agreed upon that will also save money. And then we'll use that money to spend on climate and spending down the deficit. So we see a pathway forward. Unfortunately, many of the other pieces that we're riding along with this climate, jobs, and justice provision will likely be left behind in order to get over the finish line. As Charles said, a slimmed down package. But in the next, starting, I think probably in April, you'll see a lot more public announcements and sort of discussions about negotiations, and you'll see it on the floor, I would guess, in April or May. And those are our opportunity months to get this done and to really take the action we need to reduce emissions by half by 2030. And I will stop there, just saying your voices are very important around health. It very much resonates with the public. You are very credible messengers. Time and time again, polling suggests doctors and other medical professionals, whether they're nurses or public health professionals, you're very credible with the public. You're credible with members of Congress. And so you have a lot of opportunities and you have a lot of heft when you do raise your voices. So I also encourage you to do so as we move forward. And thank you so much. Looking forward to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. So now I'm going to take the prerogative to ask you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I will make sure. Well, let me start with one question I have, and then we'll jump to some of the audience questions. And there's some good, questions around infrastructure bill, which we can also discuss in our next section, which is more specifically focused on infrastructure as well. So if we don't get to those, we can then. So as we, this is a question for all of you. Now, as we prepare for meetings like those in Congress tomorrow, where we talk a lot about clean energy, sometimes our advocates are concerned about talking or leading with equity and justice with policymakers and staff who do not prioritize it or even have a history of racist policymaking. And I often emphasize that we can't shy away from it if we don't deliver the message about health equity inequities. Who else will? Are we missing that opportunity as health professionals? So because I've had this question come up a lot in our advocacy work, I'm just wondering if you all have any thoughts or advice for folks who are approaching this issue, especially if it is with more conservative offices or offices that aren't necessarily leading on this issue.
Yeah, I would say those uncomfortable conversations are something that has to be had. That is what moves our nation forward, is addressing the issues that we see and we face as a people, but also confronting those who may feel different. I think being uncomfortable is just a sign of progression, and being able to articulate that in whatever space that you're in is critically important, especially in the provisions that go into legislation. So I would encourage you all to have those uncomfortable conversations, but also be mindful of the people that you're speaking with and understand that they may have a different perspective. So.
I think for myself, I come from a place of storytelling and making sure that I connect with the individual. I had an opportunity where I got to speak with Representative Lois Frankel, and I told her about the challenges that we were having in Boynton Beach. And she immediately picked up the phone and made a call and made a connection for me on the spot, because I made that personal connection about what we were experiencing. And I think when you do that, they see that and they're willing to go the extra mile on your behalf.
I agree with all of that, 100%, both of those comments.
Awesome. Thank you all. Yeah, that's so important, and 100% agree that the uncomfortable conversations are important, and often less on, especially when you're meeting with Congress and you're talking to a younger staffer. It's probably likely less of an issue that you might think it is. So one other question, I'm kind of moving to some of the questions in the chat. Somebody, Ethan asked, kind of a very specific energy question. And, this is a good to talk about kind of local versus large scale policy. He asked, are investments in small household solar still a good idea, or do you see larger scale community solar and wind projects close enough on the horizon to make the cost of individual installations exceed the benefits? I know that's a little bit more technical, but luckily you all have a lot of background in this.
Yeah, I'll just go real quick, and Charles probably knows even more about this than I do, but I just say yes and yes. We need the rooftop solar, we need the community solar, we need the large scale solar. We need the solar on schools, we need the solar on businesses. We are going to need a much bigger electrical grid and much more electric capacity than we have right now if we're going to phase out fossil fuels. If nothing else, the horrible Russian aggression that's harming the people of Ukraine demonstrates just how much our reliance on fossil fuels really puts us in a bad place for health and for national security as well. And so anyway, we're going to need a lot more electricity generation. So I just say yes, we need it all. Solar everywhere we can put it, wherever it makes sense.
I would piggyback off of what Matthew said, both on the yes and yes. I think that the more solar that we have online, the better our chances are of combating the climate crisis. So I think that we have to continue to invest federally into some of these programs and these grants and tax credits, so that more people can afford to put solar on their homes and also invest in larger scale community solar projects. I think that all of that will only benefit us in terms of how we move forward as a nation and the world.
Yes, but I take it a step further and I challenge the question of who has access to both these distributed energy resources and who has solar. Yes, we need all of it, but at the end of the day, the question is going to be like, not everybody is going to be able to access it and access it equitably. And so that's why opportunities like the California High DER and the Midwest Reliability Grid Planning are important, because we need to really think about who has access to these resources.
Fantastic. Yes, I totally agree. And thank you all. I want to squeeze in one more. We have a couple minutes left. Let me see, making sure. One kind of more about the local and state policy. A lot of our advocates are working at the state and local level, and Olivia, you covered really well some of the most important ways to engage with public utility commissions and the importance of renewable portfolio standards and carve out for low income solar. So are there kind of state or local policy trends that you see in energy policy that are currently happening? Some of the state level legislation, and in just thinking ahead to potentially post November, how important state policy might become. Just any thoughts on kind of trends in energy policy legislation that we can watch and engage in?
I'm really seeing community solar as one of an uptick, because you have, for the folks who can't, they don't own their roof or they can't put solar on their roof, how do they get access to these clean energy resources? And so you have a state like New Mexico that just recently passed community solar legislation, and then they have a carve out that says a percentage of this is going to go for low income individuals. So I think seeing an uptick in community solar, but being very specific about, we're going to make sure we set aside a percentage of these benefits for communities. Another thing I'm seeing a lot of is a push to define, what do these communities actually look like? You can't just go out and say, we're going to serve all the Black people, all the brown people. We can't do that because there's so many constitutional restrictions that exist. So being very specific about, how do we target these communities? And a lot of those things they use to target it can come from people in the medical profession saying that these communities do have a higher risk of air pollution, or asthma rates are higher, children are exposed to this. By being able to be specific about that, we're able to skirt around the race issues and the race challenges that we have, and be able to target those communities more specifically.
All right. If there aren't any other thoughts there, unfortunately, we're at our time. I think we could have so much more conversation, and hopefully we might be able to bring you all together for some more conversation in the future. But I really appreciate you all being here today, and for the work you're doing. We look forward to partnering with you all, especially continuing to partner with you on these efforts. Thank you so much for being here.